Welcome to Snail Story, where slow, emotional love stories unfold with honesty and heart. Have you ever believed that a cruel bet could turn into something real? In today's story, a cold-hearted CEO marries a laundry girl for a bet, but 3 months later, he ends up losing something far more valuable than money: his heart. So go ahead, grab a warm cup of coffee, and let's begin the story. Golden sunlight bathed the manicured gardens of the Kingsley estate, where a private soiree was underway, an exclusive gathering of the city's elite. The clinking of champagne glasses echoed in the air, accompanied by polished laughter from suited gentlemen and silk-draped ladies. Yet, apart from the crowd, Ethan Kingsley, CEO of Kingsley Group and heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire, stood alone, leaning on the second-floor balcony, his cold gaze detached from the festivities below. He watched everything like a man observing a world that didn't belong to him. At 30, Ethan had it all: power, prestige, money. He'd graced the cover of Forbes, negotiated million-dollar deals with a face carved in stone. To him, life was a chessboard, and he never lost, not even when he didn't care about the prize. "You always stand outside the world, Ethan." A voice broke the silence behind him. Brandon Hale, his longtime friend and business partner, approached with a glass of whiskey and a look that spelled mischief. "That's because I don't enjoy watching people pretending to rule the world with punchlines and overpriced cologne," Ethan replied coolly, lips curling in a slight smirk. "Then let me offer you a real game." Brandon took a sip and pointed toward the side of the garden, near the kitchen area, where some staff had stepped away for a break. Among them was a young woman in a pale gray laundry uniform, carefully picking up towels that had fallen from a tray. She was petite, hair tied back neatly, her face fresh and bare. Yet there was something quietly striking about her. Sophie Dawson. "She works for the laundry service," Brandon said, his tone teasing. "I bet you can't marry her and live with her for 3 months. Pull it off and I'll sign over 15% of the Midtown real estate project you've been eyeing." Ethan raised an eyebrow. The project was nearing a major funding round, yet Brandon held final control over it. "You want me to marry a laundry girl in exchange for shares?" he asked, as if checking he hadn't misheard. "Not that different from the deals you make every day, is it? Contracts, negotiations, and maybe, if you're lucky, a surprise or two." Brandon shrugged, that smirk never leaving his face. Ethan was silent for a few seconds. His eyes followed Sophie as she gave a soft smile to the elderly butler who had just thanked her. That smile, it didn't resemble the rehearsed grins of socialites he'd grown used to. It was real, and that, oddly enough, piqued his curiosity. 3 months, Ethan said slowly. "Shares get transferred the moment the ceremony ends." Brandon nodded. "I'll have my lawyer draft everything. The rest is up to you." The next morning, Sophie Dawson showed up at the Kingsley estate as usual, carrying a laundry bin and her cracked screen phone. She had no idea Ethan was already waiting, watching her from the top of the staircase. He descended like a figure from an old painting, composed, elegant, every step carrying weight, his face unreadable, his voice like a command. "Are you Sophie Dawson?" Sophie looked up, startled. The CEO, who'd never once spoken to staff, had just said her name. "Yes, sir. Is there something wrong with the laundry service?" No, I have a proposition." Sophie froze. Nothing from a man like Ethan Kingsley was ever simple, and his offer stunned her. "I want you to marry me for 3 months. After that, we'll divorce, and you'll receive $200,000. I'll also cover your siblings' tuition through college." "You think I'm what? A product on a shelf?" Sophie shot back, her anger rising. "No. I think you're smart enough to see this for what it is. A good deal." There was a fire in Sophie's eyes. She'd once held a full-ride university scholarship, which she gave up to raise her 2 siblings after their parents died in a car crash. She'd pinched every penny for rent, slept 3 hours a night working double shifts, but never, not once, had she considered selling her pride. This time, though, it wasn't just about money. It was about her siblings' future. Sophie bit her lip. "I need time to think." I'll wait until tonight. After that, I'll find someone else." No sweet words, no persuasion, no promises of love. Ethan turned and walked away. Sophie remained frozen in place, arms still clutching the laundry bin, eyes locked on the man who just might turn her life upside down. That night, Sophie sat in their cramped apartment, under the soft hum of a shaky ceiling fan. The room was dim, lit by a single yellow bulb. Her siblings were fast asleep, one with her face still in a textbook after studying late. Sophie watched them, their small, peaceful faces, and her heart clenched. Ethan's offer was like a storm, real, terrifying, impossible to ignore. One part of her screamed to say no, to keep her dignity, but another voice whispered, "They'll have a chance at a better life. You can survive 3 months. Just 3 months." The next morning, Sophie returned to the Kingsley estate. She stood outside Ethan's office, hand trembling slightly. Her heart pounded. She had never stepped into a world like his. A world built on power, where people were born on mountaintops. But today, she would walk in and stake everything she had on a gamble for her family. The door opened. Ethan sat behind his desk, face unreadable. He looked up briefly when he saw her. "Have you decided?" Sophie drew in a deep breath. "I accept, but I have conditions." Ethan raised an eyebrow. Not in anger, but curiosity. No one had ever dared negotiate. With him. "Go on. No one can know this is a deal. I'll live as your wife, at least on paper. But I'll keep working. Not here. I'll return to the laundry shop. I won't be dependent on your money." "You think you're in a position to negotiate?" "I think this is a business arrangement, and like any good deal, if it doesn't benefit both parties, it'll collapse." A beat of silence. Ethan stared at her, a long, cold look, but not one, filled with contempt. Then he nodded. "Very well. My lawyer will draft the contract. The wedding is in 2 days." 2 days later, Sophie stood at the steps of the city courthouse in a simple white dress. There were no wedding flowers, no diamond rings, no friends offering congratulations. Just Ethan, Brandon, the man who initiated the bet, and 2 witnesses, hired from a law firm. When the judge asked, "Miss Sophie Dawson, do you agree to marry Ethan Kingsley?" Sophie answered clearly, "I do." It wasn't a vow spoken from love, but from a promise. A silent promise to the 2 younger siblings waiting for their sister to somehow cover their school fees by the end of the year. And she reminded herself she wouldn't lose anything else, not even an inch of herself, only these 3 months. After signing the papers, Ethan brought Sophie back to the Kingsley estate. Not as an employee this time, but as his wife, at least on paper. In the car, not a single word passed between them. The silence was so heavy she could hear Ethan's fingers tapping lightly against the window pane. Sophie stared outside. The streets she once knew now seemed foreign, unreal. Deep down, she knew, from this moment on, nothing would be the same. Again. The Kingsley estate looked just as dazzling as the first time she saw it. But when Sophie stepped inside this time, every pair of eyes turned to her. The assistant, the butler, the chef, the gardeners. Whispers floated through the hall without any attempt to hide them. "Who is she? I heard she works in laundry. No way. That girl married Mr. Kingsley?" Ethan didn't seem to care. He walked straight up the stairs, turning back only once, to say coldly, "Prepare a room for Miss Dawson." "The master bedroom, sir?" the butler asked hesitantly. "No, a separate room." That single line was a razor-sharp boundary. Ethan wasn't hiding that this was a contract, but he also had no intention of pretending it was some fairy-tale romance. To him, it was still a game, calculated and controlled, just like every business deal he'd ever made. Sophie was given a room at the far end of the 2nd floor, far from Ethan and far from the curious stares of the house staff. She held up her end of the agreement. Each morning she left the estate and returned to her old job at the laundry shop. In the evening, she dined quietly alone. Ethan, as expected, was consumed with work. He appeared at the mansion only briefly, usually tucked away in his office. They barely spoke, except for the occasional polite exchange. One evening, as Sophie was reading in her room, a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Ethan, a glass of red wine in hand. "I just wanted to make sure you're not planning to walk out early," he said. Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You think I'd break the agreement?" "I think people are often weaker than they realize." "Then I'm not the kind of people you're used to." There was a pause. Ethan looked at her longer than usual. His gaze wasn't cold, it was calculating, reassessing, like he was beginning to understand this woman wasn't as easy to pin down as the others who had flocked around him in the past. "You're not like the women I usually meet, and I don't intend to be." The door closed behind him, and for the first time since stepping into this estate, Sophie smiled. It was a small smile, but real. She knew she was in a world that wasn't hers. But if Ethan Kingsley thought she would be easily swallowed by it, then he had chosen the wrong woman. The first 3 days at the Kingsley estate passed slowly, almost as if time itself were testing Sophie's endurance. Every step she took was watched. Every word she spoke was scrutinized, and every breath she drew inside this grand mansion felt misplaced. From the chef to the gardener, no one said anything outright, but their stares were loud enough. A laundry girl turned CEO's wife overnight. It wasn't something people digested easily, but Sophie Dawson was not the kind of woman who needed approval from those who judged her. She hadn't come here to play the dutiful wife, much less to impress anyone. 3 months, she reminded herself, was a countdown to the end of a deal. When it was over, she'd return to her life, her 2 siblings, her humble laundry shop, and the dreams she'd left behind. What surprised her most, however, wasn't the cold shoulders of the staff or the silent judgment in Brandon's eyes every time he dropped by. It was Ethan Kingsley. He was barely present. Aside from the occasional morning encounter in the dining room, where he drank espresso while she silently ate toast, they barely interacted. He always appeared in a perfectly pressed white shirt, hair sleek, eyes devoid of any discernible emotion. Sometimes, Sophie wondered if he was even real, or just a high-functioning prototype built to win games. One Saturday morning, Sophie was outside behind the estate, helping the gardener hang laundry, something she'd volunteered to do just to kill time, when Ethan showed up. But not in his usual office attire. He wore a simple black t-shirt and dark jeans. For the first time, Sophie saw him not as the CEO from magazine covers, but as an ordinary man. "You don't need to do this anymore," Ethan said, genuine confusion in his voice. Sophie didn't look up. She continued pinning towels to the clothesline. "I'm not the type to sit around and wait for 3 months to pass in a cold room. I need something to keep me from going insane." Ethan paused for a moment. "You really think you can detach from everything here?" "I have nothing to blend in with," Sophie replied, finally meeting his gaze without a hint of fear. "And you? Do you think just because I'm living in this mansion I'll start chasing after you like all the other women who've passed through your life?" Ethan frowned. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not women, not employees. No one had dared look him in the eye and strip him bare the way Sophie just did. She didn't know it, but that was the moment he truly saw her. Not as a pawn in some bet, but as a real person. Someone who didn't need him. Someone who didn't look up to him like some kind of savior. Someone who confused him. That night, Ethan came home late. Sophie had already eaten and was now in the mansion's library, the one place she'd grown to love since moving in. No staff went there, no whispers followed her around, just the comforting scent of old books and the peace she'd been craving. Ethan walked in, looking for a few archived documents, but stopped when he saw her. She was sitting on the sofa by the window, reading under a soft amber desk lamp. The light cast gentle shadows on her tilted cheekbone, highlighting her features in the stillness of the room. "You know," Sophie said without looking up, "the strangest thing about this house is that everything is beautiful, expensive, but it's completely cold." Ethan stepped closer. "You'd prefer somewhere warmer? I prefer places where people are honest, even if they're poor." You're judging me? I'm talking about the house. Not you, she said, closing her book and looking at him. Though, if we're going there, you haven't exactly made it any warmer either. To his surprise, Ethan chuckled, just briefly, a soft sound, as if even he didn't realize it had escaped. You're the first person who's ever spoken to me like that. Maybe I'm the first person who doesn't need anything from you. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but thoughtful. And in that pause, something shifted. The usual chill in Ethan's eyes softened ever so slightly, and a trace of warmth crept into the emotional wall Sophie had built around herself. The next morning, Sophie received a parcel. Inside was a small, finely crafted wooden box, and a handwritten note. This is a premium membership card to the city library, reserved for research scholars. I remember you mentioned once you wanted to study literature. E. Sophie held the card in her hand, frozen. It wasn't the gift that moved her. It was the thoughtfulness of it. Ethan had remembered. A passing comment she'd made during what she assumed was a forgettable conversation. For the first time, her heart wavered. That evening, she returned to the library. She sat by the window, card in hand, staring out at the night sky. 3 months. It might feel longer than she thought, and this marriage might not stay as simple as the contract said it would be. A week had passed since Ethan gave Sophie the library card, and still she hadn't gone, not because she didn't want to, but because she no longer understood her own feelings. The small wooden card sat neatly on her bedside shelf. Every morning, when she woke, she looked at it. Every night before bed, she glanced at it again. It had no monetary value, yet it felt unbearably heavy. Because it wasn't part of the contract, there were no clauses, no conditions. It was an act born of genuine thoughtfulness, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. Each morning, Sophie still left the Kingsley estate and made her way to the small laundry shop where she used to work. Her former co-workers, mostly immigrants and blue-collar laborers, had no idea she was now married to Ethan Kingsley. Sophie had made sure of that, telling them only that she was doing extra domestic work for a wealthy family. She didn't want pity. She didn't want the judgment that came with being seen as the girl who married rich to escape. And she certainly didn't want to explain a marriage that even she couldn't properly define. At the shop, everything was the same. The scent of soap, the whir of machines, the giggles of girls her age gossiping during breaks. But today, Sophie couldn't blend into it like she used to. In her mind, Ethan's voice echoed, "You're the first person who doesn't need anything from me." Was that what he truly believed? Or was he hoping she would? That afternoon, when Sophie returned to the estate, Ethan wasn't there. The butler informed her he was in an emergency meeting with the investment board and might be back late. Normally, she would have nodded, gone to her room, and had dinner alone. But this time, she asked, "Will he be eating at home?" The butler blinked in surprise before replying softly, "Uncertain, Miss Dawson. Likely quite late." Sophie nodded, but instead of heading upstairs, she stepped into the kitchen. The Kingsley kitchen was a world of its own, 3 times the size of the apartment she'd once shared with her siblings, filled with the latest appliances. But tonight, Sophie didn't need any of them. Just a pan, a few slices of fresh beef, asparagus, mushrooms, and a bit of butter. A simple meal. One. She used to cook for her father every weekend before he passed away. She wasn't trying to win Ethan over with food. She simply wanted to do something, not written into any agreement. When everything was ready, she set the plates on the table. Nothing fancy, just seared beef, a few pieces of garlic toast, and a bowl of warm mushroom chicken soup. And right then, the front door opened. Ethan walked in, his jacket off, sleeves casually rolled, looking more tired than usual. He paused when he saw the kitchen lights on and smelled the food in the air. Sophie was placing spoons onto a wooden tray. "What are you doing in here?" His voice was low, not angry, but clearly surprised. She didn't turn around. "Didn't. You say I didn't have to do anything. Well, cooking isn't part of my duties. I thought you didn't want to be involved in my life." I still don't, she replied evenly. But I didn't do this for you. I did it for me. Ethan stood there for a moment, then quietly hung his coat and sat down at the table. They ate in silence. No soft music, no expensive wine, just the occasional clink of silverware and the gentle glow of kitchen lights. "You're a good cook," Ethan said after a few minutes. Sophie looked up, surprised. "That's the first compliment I've ever heard from you." "I don't compliment easily, and I'm not easily impressed." Their eyes met. A moment passed. Quiet, unspoken, fragile, but something flickered in that space between them, a feeling unnamed, glowing softly beneath the surface. Later that evening, Ethan didn't retreat to his office. Instead, he stood on the library balcony, a glass of water in hand, looking out at the city below. Sophie was inside the library sitting, quietly with an open book on her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. "Why don't you turn on the light?" Ethan asked. "Too much light makes me feel exposed." "Exposed to what?" "To things I'm not ready to face." Ethan didn't answer. But for the first time, he understood. He understood why she kept her distance, why she seemed so strong. Yet sometimes he could feel an ache inside her that had no name. And Ethan Kingsley, the man who believed he could control everything, was beginning to realize there were things he couldn't command. Like the way Sophie looked at him, steady, unflinching, unreadable. The next morning, Sophie was heading out as usual when Ethan suddenly asked, "Want me to give you a ride?" She paused, just slightly. "No need. I'm not the CEO's wife." He watched her walk out the door, lips pressed into a thin line. Not the CEO's wife. But not just the laundry girl anymore, either. She had unsettled him, made him think, made him want to do something that wasn't tied to any business deal. And that, Ethan Kingsley realized, was something he had never planned for. The weekend arrived faster than Sophie expected. To her, it was just another couple of ordinary work days, washing, drying, folding clothes, and bundling them up for customers. But this time, as she stepped out of the little laundry shop on Willow Street, she froze. Parked across the road was a sleek, black Bentley. Ethan stood by the car, hands in his pockets, white dress shirt sleeves casually rolled up. He looked nothing, like the stern CEO seen at financial press conferences. There was something different about him today. Something closer, like he was trying not to stand so far from the world she belonged to. Sophie narrowed her eyes. "What are you doing here?" Ethan walked toward her, not answering immediately. "I thought it was time I understood you better." Sophie blinked. "I'm not a puzzle for you to solve, Ethan." "No," he replied. "But I married you without knowing anything about you. I figured I should start somewhere." A part of her wanted to turn him down, but another part, the one that remembered him quietly placing the library card on her desk, the one that saw the hesitation in his eyes when words failed him, made her nod. "Then follow me. But don't say I didn't warn you." She didn't take him to a fancy estate. Sophie led Ethan deep into a narrow alley on the east side of the city, to the small apartment building where she and her siblings had lived since their parents died. The second-floor unit was cramped, the paint peeling and the wooden stairs creaked with every step. The moment she opened the door, 2 kids came running. "Sophie!" A girl of about 10 squealed, pigtails swinging, cookie crumbs stuck to her fingers. "Baking again, huh?" Sophie smiled and hugged her, then turned toward a boy around 13, hunched over a workbook. "Ken, this is—" She hesitated. Ethan stood quietly at the threshold. The room was small, the furniture worn, but everything was tidy. On the table sat 2 frayed backpacks, a stack of used textbooks, and a chart of monthly expenses taped to the wall. The whole place radiated the kind of effort that came from holding life together by the seams. "Are you Sophie's friend?" the girl asked, tilting her head with curiosity. Sophie gave a faint nod. "His name is Ethan." Ethan moved to sit near the study table. The look in his eyes wasn't the look of a CEO. It was the gaze of someone seeing, for the first time, a world without marble floors and polished oak. "What's your name?" he asked. Emma, she chirped. That's Ken. Do you like cookies? I do. And to his surprise, the answer came out honest. Almost easy. Ken studied him for a moment, then asked more carefully, Are you really Sophie's boyfriend? Ethan hesitated. Sophie held her breath. Then he smiled. A smile he didn't even know his face was capable of. I'm trying to be someone decent to your sister. Ken said nothing, but the guarded look in his eyes softened a little. Later, Sophie brought Ethan out to the balcony. Evening was settling in, and the soft glow of street lamps filtered over lines of laundry still hanging below. Somewhere in the distance, children's laughter rang out from a pickup soccer game in the alley. This is my world, Ethan, Sophie said, leaning against the rusty railing. Nothing comes easy here. I used to think if I worked hard enough, I could get the kids out of this place. But the harder I tried, the smaller I felt against this city. Ethan didn't respond right away. He looked down the alley where an old man pushed a bread cart past, then turned to Sophie. You're not small, Sophie. You just weren't born with the tools I was given to fight back. Well, I didn't even have someone to teach me how to use the ones I do have. Maybe I should start doing that. She turned to him, eyes sharp with a mix of doubt and curiosity. What are you trying to do, Ethan? Feel guilty? Or is this just another part of your game? I'm not sure anymore, he admitted. All I know is, today was the first time this world didn't feel boring. The words weren't poetic, they weren't rehearsed, but they made Sophie pause. Not because she believed him entirely, but because she saw something in his eyes, something shifting, something real, he was beginning to feel. When Ethan was about to leave, Emma handed him a small bag of cookies wrapped in a paper towel. For you, she beamed, because you smiled a lot today. Ethan accepted the bag, and as he walked away from the apartment building, he didn't look back. But Sophie stayed on the balcony, watching his figure disappear into the city streets. No one at the Kingsley estate had ever asked where she lived. No one had ever tasted Emma's cookies. No one had cared what subject Ken was struggling with in school. Only him, the man who once made her feel like a bargaining chip in a business deal. And now, the first person to step into her world with kindness. Ever since Ethan visited the tiny apartment Sophie shared with her siblings, something had shifted. He never spoke about it after returning to the Kingsley estate. No texts, no phone calls, no follow-up comments. But Sophie noticed the change in him, clear and unmistakable. It was in the way he looked at her and in the way he began looking at himself. He started coming home earlier. He ate dinner at the house instead of in his office or at some upscale restaurant. Sometimes he wandered into the kitchen just for a glass of water and would pause, surprised, seeing Sophie jotting down her siblings' expense list. On some nights he'd walk into the library to find her reading and quietly sit across from her without saying a word. No more cold remarks, no more indifferent stares. Ethan Kingsley, the man who once claimed emotions are just noise in a transaction, was beginning to let himself be disrupted. Sophie felt it too. She couldn't deny that Ethan's quiet attentiveness stirred something in her heart, gently but undeniably. Yet each time his gaze lingered longer than it used to, each time he casually handed her a cup of hot tea when the weather turned chilly, a warning bell rang in her mind. This is still a deal. This started as a bet. She couldn't afford to forget that, because if she did, she might be the one to lose everything. On a Friday afternoon, just as Sophie came back from the laundry shop, she noticed the estate felt different. It had been cleaned top to bottom, not like it was being prepped for guests, but more like it had purpose. The gloomy oil paintings on the walls had been replaced with warm landscape photos. A small white vase of fresh flowers now sat in the center of the dining table. Simple, but elegant. She walked into the kitchen and found Ethan speaking with the interior manager, going over a checklist of updates to the shared spaces. "What are you doing?" she asked, skeptical. "I think this house could use a little more warmth," Ethan replied, his tone even. "You used to say it was perfect. I used to think I was perfect." Sophie fell silent. For the first time she saw Ethan humble, not the kind of humility meant to impress, but the kind that comes from someone finally confronting the limits of their own life. That night, Ethan had dinner with Sophie like it was the most natural thing in the world. No one in the kitchen dared to question it, but the curious stares had faded. Even the staff could see it. The man who once carried frost on his shoulders was changing. Sophie ate slowly, as if weighing something in her mind. She knew that if she kept her distance, Ethan might step back, but if she moved closer, what would she find waiting for her? After the meal, Ethan looked up and asked, "Tomorrow is Emma's birthday, isn't it?" Sophie blinked, startled. "You remembered?" "I have a good memory. And I thought, maybe we should do something for her." Sophie went quiet. No one else had remembered Emma's birthday since their parents died. Every year, Sophie had scraped together just enough for a small cake, a cheap stuffed animal, and a whispered birthday wish in their cramped room. "I don't want her to feel awkward," she said softly. "I'm not planning a 5-star hotel event, just a simple dinner, a few of her favorite things, and if you'll allow me, I'll bake the cake myself." Sophie laughed. "Ethan Kingsley baking a cake? No. But I can learn." For the first time, Sophie saw something endearing in this man. A man who once believed he could buy anything, now learning how to give without asking for anything in return. The next day, Ethan showed up in the kitchen wearing a white apron and holding a scribbled recipe for strawberry cupcakes. Sophie stood beside him, supervising his every move. "Don't beat the batter like that," she instructed. "Are you laughing at me? I've never seen a CEO so afraid of raw eggs." They laughed, and for the first time since Sophie had moved in, the kitchen was filled with laughter. The cupcakes came out slightly burnt, but smelled amazing, and when Emma walked in, her eyes lit up like fireworks. "Sophie, did Ethan make these for me?" Ethan nodded. "With a promise that you'll always smile like that." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Sophie sat alone on the balcony. The night breeze was cool, but something stronger stirred inside her. A feeling of safety. Something genuine. But just as that warmth spread, a sharp fear pierced through it. What if this is still just part of the game? What if, on day 90, he turns away like none of this ever happened? Sophie looked up at the sky. She didn't know if she had truly fallen in love, or if she was simply clinging to hope in a game she never agreed to play. Ever since Emma's small birthday celebration, the atmosphere at the Kingsley estate had changed. The staff no longer whispered when Sophie passed by. They began to smile, greet her politely, and even ask what she'd like for breakfast. But the biggest change was Ethan. He no longer spent his nights locked away in the study. Instead, he started ending meetings early just to be home in time for dinner. Strong whiskey was replaced with warm tea. Quiet evenings in the library now included soft laughter. And every morning Sophie would find him standing on the balcony, coffee in hand, gazing out at the city like he was searching for something. He was searching for her, and that made Sophie's heart skip, no matter how hard she tried to hide it. But like any story inching toward peace, the storm had quietly begun to return. On Wednesday afternoon, Brandon showed up, uninvited. As Ethan's longtime friend and business partner, he strolled into the Kingsley mansion like he owned the place. "Kingsley, haven't seen you at the club in a while," Brandon said casually, pouring himself a drink from the bar in Ethan's office. Ethan looked up from his laptop, eyes sharp. "Been busy." "Busy with the new wife?" Brandon laughed. "Whole city's buzzing about how you married a laundry girl. The tabloids are already spinning conspiracy theories." Ethan didn't reply. He simply closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. "I came to remind you of something," Brandon continued, his voice taking on a colder edge. "We had a deal. Marry her. Live with her for 3 months. Prove you could turn any woman into a society lady." Then I transfer the Empire real estate shares. But you're crossing the line now. What are you talking about? You're baking. You brought her to meet clients. You even laugh around her. Ethan, this isn't a game. Anymore. You're getting soft. Tension filled the room. Ethan rose and walked to the bar. Not for whiskey, but to pour himself a glass of cold water. I never told you I was predictable, he said. Brandon narrowed his eyes. You've fallen for her, haven't you? Ethan didn't respond right. Away. But for the first time, his eyes didn't dodge the question. Brandon scoffed with a half-smile. Careful. Once real feelings get involved, you won't just lose the bet. You'll lose the empire your father built. Ethan gripped his glass tighter but didn't say a word, because Brandon was right about one thing. The game was becoming real. And when that happened, the man who set the rules would no longer be the one in control. That evening, Sophie didn't find Ethan in the library as usual. The butler explained that he had a guest. Part of her felt relieved, not having to face those warm eyes that were beginning to scare her, but another part of her felt hollow. She went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. Around midnight, she stepped into the hallway and caught sight of Ethan standing alone in the garden, phone in hand, but not making any calls. She walked quietly up to him. You okay? He turned, looking more tired than usual. Just thinking. About work? About choices. He paused, then asked, if you knew you were living inside something fake, what would you do? Sophie froze. Her heart pounded. I'd walk away. Before it breaks something inside me. Ethan looked directly at her. What if that something fake started becoming real? Sophie didn't know how to answer, because she too was wrestling with that very question. 2 days later, Brandon returned, this time with a plan. He invited Sophie to lunch under the pretense of being a family friend. Sophie hesitated but agreed, not wanting to appear rude in the eyes of society. But throughout the meal, Brandon's words were veiled with subtle venom. You know, Ethan's never really stuck with anyone. He gets bored quickly. I'm not the clingy type, Sophie replied coolly. Good, because I worry you might forget. He didn't marry you out of love. Sophie clenched her napkin. Brandon smirked and sipped his wine. If I were you, I'd start planning your exit. After 90 days, the deal ends, and Ethan will go back to his world, a world you never belonged to. That night, Sophie returned to the estate with a blank look in her eyes. Ethan was waiting in the library, holding the wooden library card he'd once given her. He opened his mouth to speak, but when he saw her expression, he fell silent. She walked past him, voice low but bitter. 3 months? It was just a game. And I was stupid enough to forget that. Ethan reached out and took her hand. It's not a game anymore, Sophie. But she pulled away. Too late, Ethan. Sophie's room was silent. She sat still on the edge of the bed, her eyes blank as they stared out the window. Outside, a soft rain had begun to fall, each drop tapping against the glass in a steady, dull rhythm, heavy in its simplicity. But inside her, a storm far more violent was raging. It wasn't that she hadn't suspected the bet. From the very beginning, something about this marriage felt orchestrated. But knowing was one thing. Hearing it from Brandon's own mouth, with that smug, condescending tone, was a direct blow to the fragile trust she had started to build in Ethan. 3 months. Just 3 months. All the warmth, the tenderness, the silent gestures of care. It all had an expiration date. And when the clock struck day 90, she would be the one walking away, just a prop that had served its purpose in a well-rehearsed act. Ethan stood outside her door for nearly an hour. He didn't knock. He didn't call her name. He simply stood there, as if, by sheer will, the door might open if he waited long enough. But Sophie didn't open it. She needed time, or maybe the courage to leave before her heart broke a second time. The next morning when Ethan woke up, The housekeeper informed him that Sophie had left the estate early. No note. No goodbye. She had taken only a small worn suitcase and a thin coat. Ethan rushed downstairs. The kitchen, empty. The library, quiet. The balcony where she often stood now held only a small handkerchief, the one she had embroidered for Emma. He called her. No answer. He went to the old laundry shop, only to be told she'd quit, unpaid leave. No return date. Every trail led to nowhere. For the first time in his life, Ethan Kingsley, a man who could track down anyone in 5 minutes, was completely powerless to find a woman, not because she was hiding well, but because she had left without leaving a single trace in his world, except for the pieces of his heart now cracked and scattered. Sophie hadn't returned to the old apartment where she and her siblings once lived. She knew that if she did, Ethan might find her. But more than that, she didn't want her younger siblings to see their sister fall apart. Instead, she took a job cleaning at a small lakeside cafe, mostly visited by elderly locals and wandering tourists. There, no one knew she had once lived in the Kingsley estate. No one asked about the name Dawson. No one poked into her past. There was only the scent of toasted bread and the wind over the lake to keep her company. She worked from morning to night, trying not to think about Ethan, but sometimes all it took was a male customer calling, "Sophie," in a deep voice, and her chest would tighten in a sudden, helpless ache. One afternoon, the cafe owner joked, "So, who are you?" "Hiding from Miss Dawson." Sophie only smiled, a faint, tired smile. "I'm not hiding. I'm learning how to let go." Back at the Kingsley estate, everything was falling apart. Ethan was no longer the model CEO. He skipped meetings, forgot to sign off on documents, canceled dinner after dinner with high-profile investors. Brandon began pressing the board hard. He's losing himself over a laundry girl. A week later, Ethan walked into an internal board meeting. His voice was calm, his eyes cold steel. "If anyone in this room believes I'm no longer fit to lead Kingsley Group, I'm prepared to step down." Silence fell across the table. Brandon frowned. "You've lost your mind, Ethan." "No," Ethan replied. "I've simply decided I'm done pretending that feelings don't matter." That evening, Ethan returned to the room Sophie once stayed in. He sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the handkerchief embroidered with the initials ESD, 3 small letters, holding more weight than any contract he'd ever signed. He didn't care about the shares. He didn't care about winning the bet. He just wanted Sophie Dawson. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Kingsley understood. Love isn't an investment. Love is the only thing you'd risk everything for, just to keep one person in your life. 1 week passed, then 2. Sophie didn't return to the Kingsley estate. Ethan still went to work, still attended meetings, still sat in that powerful CEO chair, but whispers began to circulate. Mr. Kingsley doesn't seem like himself anymore, because he no longer snapped over quarterly forecasts. He didn't care when competitors launched new projects. He didn't frown at numbers or question projections. Ethan simply signed papers, skimmed reports, then retreated to the corner of his office, where a hand-embroidered handkerchief with the initials ESD sat beside a photo of Sophie and her siblings she had once forgotten behind. He kept them like treasures, but the one thing he couldn't keep was her. Unable to wait any longer, Ethan hired a private investigator, for the first time in his life, not to close a deal, but to chase after a heart. 3 days later, the investigator called. Sophie had taken a job at a small lakeside diner in Cedar Hill, 2 hours from the city. She'd registered under the name S. Dawson, lived in a small room behind the kitchen, earned daily wages, and often sat by the lake at night once all the guests had gone. That very afternoon, Ethan left the company and drove there himself, to a place of quiet that had nothing to do with the world he once ruled. It was dusk when Ethan arrived. A fine mist fell through the air. He wore a simple shirt, no suit, no Bentley, no driver, just himself, and a longing so fierce it felt like it was crushing his chest with every breath. From a distance through the restaurant window he saw her, clearing tables, her brown hair tied back, sleeves rolled up. She looked the same as always, humble, diligent, but the light in her eyes was gone, the one she used to have when she smiled at him in the Kingsley kitchen. Ethan stepped inside slowly. The diner owner recognized him first, the man once featured on the cover of financial magazines, now standing in the doorway, soaked in rain, eyes fixed on just one woman. "Sophie," the owner whispered. Sophie turned. For a moment she froze. "Ethan?" Her voice trembled. He didn't speak right away. He stepped forward, stopping in front of her, hands gripping the table edge, perhaps just to keep himself from shaking. "I was wrong." Sophie didn't reply, but her eyes were already filling with tears. "Wrong to turn your life into a wager. Wrong to think I could control emotions like I control contracts." He stepped closer, his voice softer. "And most of all, wrong to let you walk away without fighting for you." Tears spilled down Sophie's cheeks. "I trusted you. Even knowing this started as a bet. I still believed maybe I could be different." "You were different," Ethan said. "So different, you made me want to throw away the bet, to throw away who I used to be." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, the ring she had never worn since their wedding day. "When I gave you this ring, I thought I was fulfilling a clause. But now, if you're still standing here, if there's still space in your heart to forgive, then I ask you, let me place it on your finger again, not for a deal, not for a game, but because I truly love you." Sophie clenched her fists. Her heart trembled at those words. She had once longed to hear them. But not like this, not after so much pain. "Ethan, love isn't something you ask for and take home like a souvenir. It takes time. It takes trust." "I know," he said, stepping back half a step, his voice humble. "I'm not asking you to come back. I just want you to know I'm ready to change, not to win you back, but because I can't keep living the way I used to." They stood there in silence, the soft rain brushing against the awning. The smell of toasted bread and kitchen smoke lingered in the air. Finally, Sophie stepped forward and gently took the ring from his hand. She didn't put it on, she just said, "If you really want a new beginning, come here every evening at this time. We'll start over, not as husband and wife, but as two people learning how to trust again." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'll come, rain or shine, even if you don't say a word, as long as I know you're still here." Sophie smiled faintly. In her misty eyes, something began to stir again. Hope. That night, Ethan didn't return to the city. He rented a small room by the lake. And just as he promised, he came back every evening, bringing simple things, a loaf of bread, a few pages from a book, and a heart learning how to love without conditions. Because in the end, after everything, he understood one thing: to keep. A woman like Sophie Dawson, you don't need a luxury car or business shares. You need truth, and a heart willing to wait. Every evening, right at 7 p.m., Ethan came to the lakeside diner. Not once was he late. At first, Sophie kept her distance. She said very little, simply offered him a cup of hot tea, and went about her cleaning. But Ethan never complained. He sat quietly at the window-side table, bringing along a book, sometimes a small wildflower plucked from the roadside. Some days he told clumsy little jokes he'd read in old magazines. Other times he just sat in silence, watching her from afar. The first week, Sophie was still hesitant. By the second, she began to smile. And by the third week, she finally asked, "Do you know how to wash dishes?" And so, they washed dishes together. In that tiny kitchen, the sound of running water mixed with laughter. The distance that once felt impossible to bridge was slowly being replaced with simple, honest things. One clear night, after a light rain, Sophie put on a thin coat and took Ethan down to the lake shore, where the breeze was gentle and the moonlight shimmered on the water. They sat on an old wooden bench, gazing into the distance. 3 months ago, Sophie said softly, "If it weren't for that bet, would you have ever looked at a laundry girl like me?" Ethan was silent for a moment, before replying, "No, but not because you weren't good enough, because I was trapped in a world where people only saw appearances. I was blind." He turned to her, "But you were the first person who made me want to open my eyes, and once I did, I couldn't go back." Sophie looked at him, deep, steady, sincere. She reached out her hand. Ethan was stunned for a moment, then gently placed his hand into hers. "I haven't fully forgiven everything you did," she whispered, like wind through the reeds. "But I believe, if someone is willing to change, real love can begin again." Ethan said nothing, just held her hand tighter, and in that quiet grip, the cracks in his heart felt like they were finally healing. 1 month later, Sophie returned to the Kingsley estate, not as a contract wife, not as a laundry girl, but as Sophie Dawson, the woman Ethan loved, unconditionally. The entire house seemed to brighten. Emma and Ken ran into her arms, cheering. The old housekeeper whispered through tears, "At last, this house feels warm, again." Ethan stood at the top of the stairs, watching her step in under the soft golden lights. No wedding gown, no fanfare, just love. He walked down slowly and pulled from his pocket the ring she had once returned. "This time," he said, "it's not for a deal, not for shares, not for Brandon, or anyone's dare." He knelt. "It's because I love you. And if you'll say yes, let me call you my wife, in the truest sense of the word." Tears streamed down Sophie's face. She reached out her hand and, for the first time, slipped the ring on herself. "I do. Not because you're a CEO, but because you're a man who's learned to love and learned how to say, 'I'm sorry.'" The wedding took place a month later. No media, no luxury spectacle. Just a few close friends, her 2 siblings, and a small garden full of hydrangeas. The flower Sophie had loved since childhood, but never dared to grow, thinking they were too fancy for someone like her. Ethan planted the entire garden himself to show her nothing is too far out of reach if you deserve it. 3 years later, the Kingsley home echoed with the laughter of a little girl. A curly-haired toddler named Hope counted numbers with the family dog. In the kitchen, Ethan wrestled with an old cookie recipe, while Sophie wiped flour off his nose and giggled. "If CEO Kingsley burns another batch of cookies, it'll be a scandal. Good thing I don't need to keep up appearances anymore. Just need to keep my wife's heart." She narrowed her eyes at him, playfully. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and in that quiet moment, Ethan knew he had won, not the bet. He had conquered himself to keep the girl who once was just a condition in a contract. And now, she was his forever. From a loveless contract to a real wedding, they crossed pain, misunderstanding, forgiveness, and found their way back to love. Thank you for watching this slow but soulful journey with Snail Story. If this touched you, hit like, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartfelt tales. If you had to rate this story out of 10, what would your score be? Let us know in the comments below.